I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Manhunt creator Monica Beletsky. Monica, Manhunt is set during a flashpoint in American history. So, what would you like audiences to take away from this story, other than, of course, being entertained?
I would love for them to take away that we highlight some unsung American heroes like Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, who leads the investigation, and Mary Sims, who was just a footnote in the trial transcripts in the conspirators trial, who I then developed into one of the lead characters for the show. And it's been very rewarding to have their stories and other stories in the show become part of the cultural conversation now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I I was thinking this subject matter has been tackled in various media over time, over many, many decades. And so it's not something that many of us are completely unfamiliar with. But I found this show to be so compelling because it's a bold new approach to the story surrounding Lincoln's assassination. Ultimately, why did you want to adapt James Swanson's book?
So I had the idea of telling the aftermath of the assassination, the investigation, as a sort of political thriller with a cat and mouse structure to it when I stumbled upon the figure of Edwin Stanton. When I realized that essentially there was no conscious president for about 12 hours, from the time that Booth shot Lincoln till Johnson was sworn in the next day, and everything from the investigation to running the government and kind of reeling from this tragic incident fell on Stanton's shoulders. I was really shocked that I'd never heard of him before, and it struck me as such a dramatic situation for a lead role. I pitched that to Apple, and coincidentally, Mr. Swanson's book became available, and my producers were aware of it and quickly, did a matchmaking so that I would have that material for research. And it's a very beloved book. It's a bestseller, and it's nonfiction. So I was able to take, his detailed research about the assassination night, about the capture of Booth, and use that a lot in the show. But I was also able to expand it into historical fiction, and true crime in the approach that I had with it.
To be honest, I had to look him up. I didn't know who Edwin Stanton was. I'd heard of the name very vaguely as maybe some kind of secretary in the cabinet. No idea how critical he was to this period in history. And I just then think, when you started really doing a deep dive, what most fascinated you about telling the story from his perspective, and what most fascinated you about him?
Um, I started the project in 2020, and I think for me, we had a lot of shows at the time that were ending that were anti-heroes as the lead. And because of sort of what was happening in the country and in my personal life, I felt that I needed a hero in the classic sense, and that was the story I needed at that time. And so I found that in him and Mary and some of the other figures in the story, where his life shows that to make change in this country, it's always needed people to sacrifice. It's always needed people to make a push. And what he was willing to sacrifice, including his own health, really moved me. And that was the kind of story that I personally needed, for inspiration to see how much one person could do, and make a difference. So it was just sort of the story I needed that I was hoping would also speak to audiences. And there was so much about him, in my experience working on shows with amazing lead characters. You pick up on, some qualities that are easier to write towards, or, more fulfilling to write towards. He had that for me. He had a work family, he had a home family, he had personal issues, he had this friendship, this collegial friendship with Lincoln. They both lost sons within a few years of each other. So they were both grieving fathers. They were very devoted fathers. That bonded them. And they were workaholics, which I relate to. And in some ways, I think of him as like the showrunner of the Civil War, because he was behind the curtains making a lot of the creative decisions about the strategy and all of that, and managing such a huge department. So that, as well as the fact that he had asthma at a time before there was medication for it, and I have a loved one who has severe asthma, and I've been in the hospital with them. So to imagine that, the medication that you need was not available, and he pushed through all that, also really moved me, and hopefully you'll see served as a good device structurally for the show as well.
I was thinking that many of us obviously are aware of what happened back in the day with Lincoln. And do you agree that it's like we almost take that fact for granted? We don't sometimes appreciate the gravity of what was happening at the time. And that's why I think I was so invested in this story, because you're very good at putting us in that time frame between the assassination and the 12 hours that you refer to, and making us really understand how grave it was and how existential it was for America. Can you talk me through that aspect, because a lot of that comes through in the writing?
Sure. I mean, the actual manhunt was 12 days, 12-day chase. And I did the math the other day, and it was about 288 hours. I had 6 hours, to tell that. And so, of course, choices need to be made. And, the great thing about dramatic writing is you take all the boring bits out of real life and you have a show. And so, I think that, to answer your question, I was really compelled by the fact that this was a period of the Civil War I hadn't really seen dramatized much. Usually the story kind of ends with Lincoln's death, and the idea that we could begin it there and see an investigation, and also the fun of a pre-forensics investigation, an investigation where Booth is essentially a needle in a haystack. He could be anywhere in North America. How do you find this guy without fingerprinting, without cell phones, without cars, without radar, without 24-hour news, all of that. So that was really fun, to subvert the expectations of the audience. Like Stanton just picks up the Derringer gun, without a glove. And, um, when Booth gets to the bridge, he's not sure if the telegraph, has gotten there to warn the guard to stop him yet, and because of technology, no one has. Stuff like that. So I thought that would be really fun to write towards, and just really fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. Now, of course, when you have a show like this, the actor who is number one on the call sheet is so critical to making this all fall into place. What does Tobias Menzies bring to the table as the lead on this show?
Oh, I think his performance is astonishing, and I loved writing Stanton's story. Tobias has such an authenticity. He's so convincing in a period show, and he helps ground and center the reality of the whole suspension of disbelief. I feel you just believe this man is in 1865, that this is him, the way he carries himself, and wears the clothes, and how he relates to people is so beautiful. And also, I think Tobias was looking for a project that had some consciousness to it, that had some purpose to it. And I think he felt he found that in this role. And not all actors want that. A lot of actors aren't focused on sort of, the show having meaning to it. It's more about the entertainment. This show, we wanted to have both, to be propulsive and entertaining, but also to strike up conversations with the people you're watching with afterwards. And I think he felt the same way. And I think he has just an innate sense of justice as a human being that he brings it to the role, a real sense of right from wrong, you know.
Yeah, he's absolutely one of my favorite people. Outlander and The Crown, and now Manhunt. But on the other hand, Anthony Boyle, he's been one of my favorite actors for some time. He's not a huge name yet. He should be, and he
Mhm.
probably will be. He's so good as John Wilkes Booth. He was really good in The Plot Against America. So I was so excited to see him and what he could do here. So magnetic and as the infamous assassin. What is that what drew you to him when he was reading for the role?
Anthony brought so much passion to the role from the moment I met him. I had a draft of all the scripts, and he really fell in love with episode 6, which just aired last weekend. And some of the writing in that really spoke to him. So it was very flattering, and we just sort of clicked as soon as we met. And he's very collaborative. We would meet, before every episode and talk for a couple hours through the scenes. And he read Booth's diaries, and he would bring me little anecdotes and say, "Oh, I love this part about him. It's so interesting. Is there any way you could get that in a scene?" So I would go and do some rewrites. And I just think he brought so much drive and commitment to the role. You could just feel it in every movement on the screen when he's leaving the theater and he's running down the alley with the broken leg. And Anthony didn't know how to ride a horse 3 weeks before we shot. So also his commitment to learning how to ride as if he's a knowledgeable rider, not just a beginner, in such a short time was exceptional and really, nail biting at sometimes. But he just did such incredible work on every level. And I think his booth is really beautiful. And that last episode is such a incredible performance.
It really is. I want as many people as possible. I'm sure you do as well to see it because it's really something. He's fantastic. Was there a role that was particularly challenging to cast? I was thinking the elephant in the room would have been Hamish as Lincoln, and he does a great job with that. And because that's the first thing you do, you watch him to think, okay, is he going to do the Lincoln like I'm expecting him to do it? Is
Hmm.
there anything like that where you can pinpoint and think this role is just becoming very difficult to cast properly?
Hmm. Honestly, the hardest role to cast was Eckert because I had cast everyone else and it was the last role. And there's so many men in the show, Manhunt. I really needed someone distinct from Hamish, from Stanton, from Stanton's son, Brandon Flynn. Um, and so, when I came across Damien O'Hare, it was incredible because he has such gravitas and such warmth. And this is silly, but he's blonde, and it just helps to distinguish him from the other guys. And it turns out he looks so much like the actual Eckert when we put the mustache on him. And I think he's just fantastic actor. So that was the hardest role, to find the right balance. But to what you're saying, of course, Lincoln was very difficult as well because, first of all, Tobias is 6'1" or 2, so for
Yeah,
him to seem taller was very challenging. Luckily, Hamish is 6'4",
yeah,
and looks so much like him, and is so folksy and verbal and warm and sensitive and smart like Lincoln. So I knew of Hamish from my theater days, and it was just wonderful that he was courageous enough to do it. Um, and he and I talked about presenting a different Lincoln than you would find on, like, a statue, or sort of have in your mind as like an icon. I brought to him the idea of, I want this Lincoln to be Stanton's colleague, this person who he's been in the trenches with for less than 4 years, but a couple years. working weekends, working nights with, so when he puts his feet on the desk, I think for some people it's shocking, but if you've worked with people 24 hours a day for several years, you're going to put your feet on the desk. That's how, it is. And, I wanted to bring back to the collective conscious, the folksiness of Lincoln, the fact that he loved plays and poetry, and he would read them in the middle of meetings and tell these stories that are kind of from his roots of being this kid who grew up in a log cabin, who was probably one of the first men who wasn't an aristocrat who became president. There's such a sort of relatability to him, and so I wanted him to be that person. And when we lost him, we felt like the loss of, Mary Lincoln's husband, not necessarily, this guy on a penny or
Yeah.
$5.
That's 100% right. What I think the writing, and of course Hamish's performance does is it humanizes him more than I've seen. You expect Lincoln to come out like some kind of god-like figure because that he's so revered, and this guy that Hamish is playing is just a man who is working really hard and who is a human being, and that is so important because then when he's taken away, the gravity of the situation really starts to hit. And I really responded to this overwhelming desire of his allies to preserve and protect the ideals that were the foundation of his, Reconstruction plans. And I just wondered then, what did it mean to you to get that aspect right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for noticing all that. Yeah, I think we showed a little bit of his more sort of performative version of himself in the second episode where we show him working on his inaugural speech. And Hamish does this incredible mimicry of what he thinks Lincoln's voice sounded like, and how this was pre-microphones, which we forget, but his voice would carry over like 10,000 people. And Hamish does this if you ever talk to him, he does this incredible example of how he must have done it. Um, but anyway, back to your question. I felt that somebody who, there's that famous book, Team of Rivals, someone who is the kind of leader who would hire people around him with differing opinions to form his own opinion is a certain kind of man, right? And so that really backed up our interpretation of him, which is that he's this guy who has an open mind. He has an open mind, but then he's very decisive. And so that tracks with the version of him, that isn't this figure that you're describing. And I think that was important structurally, like you mentioned, so that when we lose him in the assassination, we felt like we lost this guy who's very lovable. And then what I realized in writing it as well is that we didn't just lose Lincoln. We lost most of his second term. So he had only been, sworn in about a month before. And I think of him as a two-term president, but essentially we lost his second term. And there's so much that could have been put into law and done in that time to set up Reconstruction. And instead we lost that. So the show, as you probably have seen, is not just about the loss of Lincoln, the chaos of what does this mean about the end of the Civil War, but also what did we lose as a society and a culture when we lost the mandate of Reconstruction, when we lost Lincoln. And so I was very proud to get that into the show. And I don't think I could have gotten it into a show if it hadn't been for the framework of being a true crime mystery, a murder mystery, an investigation. And so, it's sort of like how Jordan Peele describes Get Out as sort of, it's horror, but he was able to Trojan horse things about our society into it. That's sort of how I looked at this, which is, it's a political thriller, it's true crime, it's a conspiracy thriller, but we can take breaths and show the stakes. And the stakes are what's going to happen to freed people, and how is this society going to deal with people who went against it, and how are we going to integrate a society, so that was all very personal and meaningful to me for sure.
Yeah, not only is this a propulsive action thriller set many, many decades ago, but it's an important piece, and I am really, really grateful that I got to see it. And congrats, Monica, on some really fantastic work.
Oh, so nice to talk to you. Thank you so much, Robert.